Nipping out the knight like that immediately contests the center and prepares for flexible pawn development, hinting at a hypermodern approach. Mirroring white's development, this creates an immediate symmetrical pawn structure and preserves flexibility for black's central pawn thrusts. Asserting central influence immediately, white aims for a flexible setup with potential pawn advances. Embracing fianchetto development, black signals a clear intent to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling, a common response to English opening structures. Paving a path for the king's bishop to fianchetto, this prepares a solid kingside setup, often leading to strategic maneuvering. Developing the bishop to this diagonal unleashes its power, preparing for kingside castling and potentially influencing the center. Solidifying control of the long diagonal, this bishop now eyes the dark squares and supports the eventual kingside castling. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount here, preparing for potential central thrusts and enabling piece development towards the queenside action. A timely castling solidifies king's safety, allowing further piece development and control over the central squares. Solidifying the center and opening lines for the queen and bishop. Fortifying the center and preparing for potential pawn pushes. This piece actively participates in the growing tension on the c4-f7 diagonal, hinting at future skirmishes for control of the queenside squares and the central d4 territory. Asserting central presence with e5 immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and opens lines for black's pieces, creating an unbalanced pawn game. Establishing central pawn presence and opening a clear diagonal for the queen. Centering the knight here initiates a classic King's Indian defense struggle, aiming to undermine white's central pawn structure with a subsequent e4 push and potentially develop pressure along the queenside. Securing the b-file and preparing to challenge black's queenside pawn structure with b4 offers white an avenue for queenside expansion and potential piece activity, all while consolidating their kingside castled position. Pushing the rook pawn forward aims to expand on the queenside, potentially creating outposts for knights or preparing a pawn lever to crack open the structure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure. This pawn push aims to prevent black's immediate b5 advance, denying them central counterplay and creating a robust defensive perimeter. Mobilizing the rook to the center, black subtly prepares to contest the semi-open file should it materialize, while also offering it as a potential defender of the central pawns. A prudent repositioning given white's kingside pawn advances. Pinning the knight on f6 immediately complicates black's central pawn structure, forcing a decision regarding the e5 pawn and potentially cramping their pieces if they opt for a passive defense. Challenging the bishop's placement immediately opens up possibilities on the kingside and questions the dark square control that white's bishop was aiming for. Sacrificing the bishop pair signals an intent to exploit a weakness in black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for attacking the king once black recaptures the knight. Regaining the bishop opens up the f-file, offering potential counterplay against white's castled king, and also challenges the control of the d4 square, unleashing a pawn storm to shatter black's queenside structure, aiming to exploit the ensuing pawn weaknesses and gain a permanent advantage in space on that flank. Unbalancing the pawn structure. This capture immediately opens the a-file, presenting dynamic possibilities and demanding attention to the queenside. Opening the a-file for your rook dramatically alters the positional landscape, potentially creating long-term pressure along that flank and offering a route for piece activity that was previously blocked. The bishop retreats to its established outpost, a natural repose after its prior skirmish on f6, reinforcing the kingside pawn structure and preparing to potentially redeploy via g5 or even e5 if circumstances allow, while carefully surveying the d4 square, which remains a focal point of potential contention in this King's Indian setup. Propelling the pawn forward disrupts black's queenside structure and claims vital space, potentially isolating that rook and creating targets for future operations, while simultaneously forcing black to react and potentially reveal their intentions concerning the central pawn majority. This repositioning of the knight to e7, while seemingly passive, aims to prepare a subtle but crucial maneuver, reinforcing the kingside defense and potentially rerouting the knight to a more active square, perhaps g6, to counter white's queenside expansion. It's a defensive undertaking, acknowledging white's space advantage on the flank and seeking to consolidate before embarking on any offensive ambitions. The quiet exchange of pieces earlier has led to a slightly cramped but solid pawn structure for black, and this knight move is about improving its internal cohesion and preparing for future developments, potentially involving the f5 square. Unlocking the c-file for potential pressure. The queen now surveys the central battlefield and aims to support any pawn thrusts while potentially joining an attack on black's king if the opportunity arises later. Opening up the queenside with this pawn thrust challenges white's control of the queenside pawn chain, aiming to disrupt its structure and potentially create counterplay on the b-file. Initiating a patient regrouping, the knight abandons its central post, aiming to redeploy to a more dynamic square, potentially supporting a kingside expansion or reinforcing the queenside advance, while simultaneously clearing the way for the queen to assert influence along the c-file. Unleashing the bishop from its fianchettoed post offers a dual purpose, activating a sleeping giant while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial central squares. With its newfound diagonal reach, potentially creating intricate webs of tactical possibilities. Exploiting the open files created by black's pawn structure, white forcibly opens the b-file to threaten further penetration and expose weaknesses in black's queenside pawn chain. Opening up the b-file. This capture fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating an isolated pawn for black on c6 and a doubled pawn majority for white on the queenside. Black's choice to recapture here injects immediate structural imbalances that will define the middle game, potentially offering queenside space for white while black aims to use the open c-file for counterplay. The rook embarks on a bold voyage to the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially create mating nets around the king, all while exploiting the semi-open b-file after the recent pawn exchanges. Unleashing the central pawn thrust here creates a vibrant clash, immediately disrupting white's intended queenside expansion and opening lines for black's pieces. This bold pawn sacrifice aims to shatter white's pawn structure on the queenside and, more importantly, to activate the formerly passive dark-squared bishop by creating dynamic counterplay in the center. The move forces white to make immediate decisions, potentially leading to tactical complications where black's pieces can flourish. Asserting control over the now open b-file becomes paramount, repositioning the rook to defend and prepare for further pressure on this critical pathway signals a shift towards exploiting the inherent weaknesses created by black's pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black ignites a tactical firestorm. This pawn thrust, e4, rips open lines and challenges white's central structure, creating immediate complications and demanding sharp calculation from white's perspective. Unleashing the d-pawn opens up the critical central files, presenting black with a direct challenge to their pawn structure and potentially their king's safety. White is aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around the black monarch, and this thrust is a significant step towards achieving that. Opening the c-file with this pawn thrust dramatically alters the positional landscape, creating a complex battlefield where piece activity will be paramount, asserting dominance on the queenside and threatening a powerful outpost. The knight's repositioning creates immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure, forcing a decision about how to address the growing spatial advantage. Opening the "c" file with the rook injects immediate dynamism into the position, directly challenging white's central pawn structure and aiming to exploit the potential weakness of the "d3" pawn. An attempt to inject immediate chaos, forcing black to confront a sharp decision that could easily splinter their carefully constructed pawn structure. This radical repositioning of the rook aims to provoke a reaction, perhaps hoping to exploit any hasty response by black and open lines towards their king, which currently feels quite secure behind its pawn shield. Black boldly sacrifices a pawn to rip open the c-file and generate some much-needed counterplay against white's otherwise imposing structure. This pawn grab disrupts white's carefully constructed central dominance and forces a re-evaluation of the immediate tactical landscape, potentially exposing the white king if black can effectively coordinate their pieces along the newly acquired open corridor, unveiling the pawn chain's weakness. This captures the intended central thrust, opening lines for the queen and rook while sacrificing a tempo to solidify control over the d-file. Seeking to inject activity and challenge white's pawn structure, this maneuver repositions the queen to a more dynamic square, eyeing potential breakthroughs along the c-file and supporting the knight's potential advance. A tactical refocus. The knight aims to participate more actively in the central struggle, potentially targeting black's weakened kingside or supporting a further pawn advance. Sacrificing the exchange now to shatter white's central pawn structure and open lines around the king is a bold declaration of intent. Securing the c-file with the queen now opens lines of attack and creates dynamic play, especially as black's pieces are somewhat awkwardly placed after the recent exchanges. This aggressive queen placement could force concessions from black, potentially weakening their pawn structure or exposing their king. The rook's relocation to the open file, challenging the white queen directly, reignites the fight for central dominance and signals an immediate tactical engagement, potentially forcing a queen exchange or creating unforeseen piece activity. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position dramatically, inviting a potential endgame where the connected passed pawns on the c and d files might become a significant advantage for black if white isn't careful with their piece coordination. Reclaiming the bishop with this recapture solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares to contest the open d-file, a crucial pathway that will likely become a central battlefield in the coming exchanges. Re-establishing central knight presence. This move aims to shore up the pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breaks in the center, while also eyeing the weakened d6 square as a future outpost. Introducing a knight to the center. This move immediately targets the advanced d3 pawn and seeks to disrupt white's unified pawn structure, creating a dynamic battleground where tactical possibilities might bloom. Challenging the knight's central outpost. This exchange simplifies the board significantly, heading towards an endgame where the knight might prove more agile than its counterpart. Reclaiming the bishop immediately stabilizes the central pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn pushes, but opens up a tempting diagonal for white's queen to potentially infiltrate later if black isn't careful. Consolidating the rook's power on the open file is a sensible step. Preparing for potential pawn pushes and aiming to restrict black's bishop mobility. Though watch for the knight's forward march that could disrupt your pawn structure. Activating the rook on the third rank injects a dynamic threat into the center, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially isolate the d3 pawn. Initiating a knight maneuver to the edge of the board, aiming to redeploy it to a more influential central square, potentially e2 or f3, to bolster the kingside defenses and prepare for a more active role in the ensuing middle game. Reuniting the bishop with its support structure offers a crucial chance to solidify the central pawn chain's defense and prepare for a more active piece deployment in the coming exchanges. Steering the knight back to f3 offers flexibility, seeking to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps g5 to menace the bishop or e5 to influence the center. This reshuffles the pieces, looking for a fresh way to exert pressure on black's slightly congested queenside pawn structure. Pushing pawns forward aggressively near the king, especially when pieces are still on the board, is a gamble that can backfire spectacularly by creating weaknesses. But here it's a bold attempt to disrupt white's relatively compact setup and open up attacking avenues. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing to support the central advance or simply consolidate the existing material imbalance. This quiet maneuver subtly reinforces white's position. It prevents any immediate kingside threats and offers a stable foundation for future action. Reshuffling the bishop. Black seeks to untangle this piece from its current passive outpost and potentially redeploy it for greater influence on the queenside or even reposition it to attack the pawn chain. The move might also be a preparatory step towards a kingside pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's knight and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces, while simultaneously defending the e4 pawn. A judicious repositioning. The king steps away from the open central files, creating a safer haven and preparing for potential maneuvers or defensive alignments as the game advances. Seeking to consolidate the rook's presence on the third rank. This maneuver subtly repositions the monarch, offering it slightly more breathing room from potential diagonal threats and preparing for future kingside pawn advances by the bishop. Clearing the back rank for potential pawn pushes by black. The rook maneuvers to a more active diagonal, seeking influence over the central squares and preparing to support any advances white might wish to make in the upcoming phase. Pushing the d-pawn opens up a critical avenue for black's remaining pieces, aiming to create a dynamic pawn chain and potentially exploit the weakened central squares. The knight retreating to its starting square feels like a confession of positional miscalculation, abandoning central influence for a mere pawn grab that ultimately yielded little. Unleashing the rook along the open file injects immediate dynamism into the position, threatening to infiltrate white's defenses and exploit any latent weaknesses that have accumulated on the queenside. Reclaiming the central diagonal for the bishop. This move aims to bolster the kingside defenses and potentially initiate a regrouping of forces after the recent pawn exchanges. A bold attempt to break open the kingside, creating potential pawn breaks and attacking lines, though it significantly weakens the king's shelter by pushing the g-pawn without proper preparation. Re-centralizing the knight to na2 might seem passive, but it's a subtle repositioning designed to bolster the e-pawn and prepare for a potential kingside maneuver, perhaps aiming for g3 or even an aggressive g4 push once the knight is secure. The knight on e2 exerts influence over key central squares and offers flexibility for redeployment, potentially to g3 to support the h-pawn or even back to f3 if the situation demands. This isn't about immediate tactical fireworks. It's about solidifying the pawn structure and creating future attacking possibilities while maintaining a defensive backbone. Introducing a new attacker to the king's vicinity can be a potent diversion, potentially unraveling white's defenses by forcing concessions or creating new targets on the king's side. The white monarch inches towards the center, a cautious but necessary step to avoid the looming threats and prepare for potential endgame scenarios. The king embarks on a daring, potentially precarious journey towards the center, aiming to activate its defensive capabilities and perhaps join the pawn storm. Reverting the knight's position signals a potential positional concession, prioritizing defense of the king's side over active piece play, but it also allows for easier regrouping on the queen side. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, black throws caution to the wind, aiming to destabilize white's somewhat placid defensive setup and create attacking possibilities around the enemy monarch. Opening the king side for attack. The pawn structure is about to undergo a drastic transformation, creating immediate lines of fire towards black's monarch. The pawn on h4, now unleashed, becomes a formidable attacking spearhead, aiming to destabilize white's kingside and pry open lines for the black pieces. The knight ventures to a more active square, seeking to disrupt black's centralized pawns and potentially create tactical opportunities. This maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a better diagonal, from which it can exert pressure on black's pawn chain and possibly support a future kingside advance. Consider the implications of this piece redistribution. Can it offer new attacking avenues or improve white's defensive structure? Observe how the knight's new placement might influence the control of key squares and affect the interplay between the opposing forces. This move hints at a deeper strategic plan, perhaps preparing to contest the open files or exploit any weaknesses in black's formation. Unleashing the bishop to *e5** is a bold attempt to activate the piece and create attacking potential, but it leaves the king's defense somewhat porous and invites further complications on the kingside. As the knight eyes a retreat to g4, opening lines for the white knight to participate in the kingside attack. Trading the bishop for the knight here, after the exchange of queens, aims to simplify the position and transition into an endgame where the remaining knight might have less scope than the bishop previously did, especially considering the pawn structure. The pawn on g4 now opens a new avenue for the king, potentially liberating it from its somewhat passive defensive posture. This pawn push dangerously weakens the king's shelter, inviting a potential cascade of threats. Attempting to solidify the pawn structure and secure space on the kingside, the bishop shifts to a diagonal that could potentially pressure black's newly advanced pawns, though it also leaves the d-pawn somewhat exposed to potential future advances. The pawn structure now looks like a pincushion, and black's attempt to activate the rook on the first rank with this rook lift seems to be a desperate measure to find some activity in a position where white's pieces are dominating the center and have greater mobility. The bishop's relocation to a8 aims to eye the kingside pawn structure and potentially support a future advance or regroup for defense, while also avoiding immediate challenges on the open files. Harnessing the bishop's potential for a surprise attack, this placement seeks to exploit the diagonal leading towards white's king, creating tactical complications and potentially forcing concessions. Opening the f-file presents a desperate attempt to inject life into white's stagnant position, aiming to leverage the open file for potential counterplay against black's king, though it simultaneously weakens the king's own shelter considerably and abandons any hope of maintaining pawn structure integrity. Embracing the initiative, The black king steams forward. A bold maneuver aiming to exploit the open lines and potentially disrupt white's currently passive setup, seeking active participation in the unfolding drama.